2014, everybody. May this be a year of health and prosperity for you. All right, so one of the best things about Node is that it's so low level that it doesn't enforce any sort of a directory structure on your app, leaving you free to do whatever you want. And one of the worst things about Node is that it's so low level that it doesn't enforce any sort of a directory structure on your app, leaving you free to do whatever you want. When you're a newcomer, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out where to begin. So in this episode, we're going to go through one way to lay out a Node application that has been pretty successful for me in getting applications into production. And do remember, this is for an application, not a module, so this layout really isn't designed for including what we write into something else. And also, if you look at it, it's somewhat inspired by Ruby on Rails. So if you come from that background, it'll look pretty familiar. Okay, so the very first thing, we still have a package file in our project. And this one is pretty much just a copy from what we had in episode 7, except the name and description are changed. The next step is to create a config folder, and let's have a look at what we're going to put in there. The first file that we're going to deal with in config is application.js. And this is where we basically bootstrap the application and load all of our things that we need to load and to get it running. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is get into a nice variable what environment we're running in. So this is to distinguish between, say, development mode, staging, production, test, QA, whatever you want to call those. If you are from the Rails world, this is analogous to the Rails env variable. Next, let's show a little trick I like to do here. This is to take the contents of our package.json and make that accessible to our program. And we'll see why that's really handy in just a second. Next, I like to do a little message saying that we're loading the app. I like the verbose output when I start it up. With that in place, then we can learn something new about Node, and that's how to do global variables. Global variables in Node carry all the same caution that you'd have in other programming environments, but they do have their uses, and here's one of them. I like to declare a variable named app, and this is going to house a lot of good information about our application. Let's look at one example of that. One thing we can put in here is the port, and I like to supply that as an environment variable, but typing process.env.port all over the place kind of seems like a bad idea. What if we ever didn't want to supply the port through the environment? We encapsulate it here in app. Now the way that we actually make a global variable is through the use of this global variable named global, and then any properties we attach to it become global variables that we can use everywhere else in the application. So what else do we put in here? Well, remember the package JSON that we loaded? I find it really useful to have the current version of our application available. For instance, let's say you're building an API and a client of it has an error. Well, if you have access to the version to include in your response or something, then it's a lot easier to debug because you know which version of it they're actually running. I also like to have a reference to the root path of the project. And we get that using path, which, yes, it's not defined yet. We'll do that in just a second. Path is a Node package, one of the core libraries that, can you guess what it handles? Paths. Completely ignoring the magical comma fix that you just saw, let's move on to why it's useful to have the path, or the root to it rather. I like to put another property on here called appPath. And this one's a function. And what this function does is you pass it a path, and then it treats that path as relative to the root of our application. And where does that come in handy? Among other places, I like to put a function on here called require, which takes a path. And I can even line up curly braces. And what require does is it calls node space require using appPath. So now when I want to require something local to my project, I don't have to deal with slash this relative path that. I just call app.require, and I know that it's off the root of my application. Next, I like to have a convenience member for getting the app's environment rather than doing process.env.node.env all over the place. And then lastly, we do a function called start. And this function is what actually starts our application. So the first thing that it needs to do is make sure that we haven't already started. So if we haven't, let's tell ourselves that we have, and then we'll use this variable that we haven't declared yet, but will in just a second. And then we give ourselves a nice little message that we started. All right, so what is this.app? We are, of course, doing an Express application, so we should probably require Express at some point. Then at the very top here, I like to just put a reference to app, which will just invoke Express for us. So this.app right here is, of course, referring to app right here. And, of course, we should probably use the correct function there, listen, not listed. Now, this app, as currently configured, is not going to do a whole lot. That's okay. We should still do a sanity check on it anyway. So we're going to need a server.js file. And if you remember from the previous episodes just how complicated server.js was, watch this. That's it. And we can test this out now by running node server and assuming we typed everything correctly, which we didn't. Let's figure this out, fix it real quick. Indeed, couldn't find Express, so we need to install our packages, and I'll spare you the details of watching that. So the npm install ran, and I was able to run the server just fine, but what you see is it says undefined mode, which is not quite what we were looking for, because if we don't specify it via the environment, we should just assume that we're in development mode. Voila. So let's get our middleware back in here. The way that we're going to do that is to just head back to the previous episode's code. Check out that middleware thing. And we're going to copy all of this and just drop it in here with a little note that we're dealing with middleware again. Now this isn't quite going to work because we don't actually have a reference to app, so we need to scope this properly, like so. And then some of these don't even make sense, like we don't want stupid logger anymore because, well, it's stupid. And we'll take these out because we're going to replace them later, not in this episode, but in another one with more useful middlewares. And then just to make sure that we did everything right, which we didn't, we come back up and we see that this app.router doesn't exist. So let's deal with that. It's the same fix as what we just did before. So just because we have the router in place doesn't mean that we actually have routes wired up, so let's go ahead and do that too. For this fix, we started a new file called config.routes.js. And this is pretty much just a paste job from episode 7, although we took out the ensure authenticated bit because we're going to deal with that at a different time and more correctly. And we'll also pull out read from DB because we don't need that route. So the first thing is we need to actually get access to this, and we can do that simply by using our app require config routes. But because that does return a function, we need to pass it something, which would just be the reference to our application. Now this isn't going to work right now because handlers isn't defined. So how would we actually get the functions that handle the routes to our router? Well, first of all, we need to have those routes someplace. And we choose to spare you a whole bunch of cutting and pasting and deleting and renaming, and just show you that we have an app.routes folder that has adventures routes, home routes, and loot routes. So we could have a look at the home routes, for example, and it does help a lot to type correctly. This function may look familiar because it is. It's pretty much the exact same thing, only I did take out the login form because That was a bad way of dealing with logging in, and we're going to do a better way. We similarly have all the routes to deal with our adventures, and of course, our loot route to see our loot. So we still need to get access to those and wire them up here, so let's do that. The very first thing that we need to do before we jump into that is fix 2 typos. First of all, that should be module.export, and then I guess I'll refix this. This was app_path. That actually needs to be app path. Great. With that out of the way, we get access to this just like we did everything else. We're going to get a variable for our home routes. We'll use our app require. And trying to wean myself off the double quotes here. This would just become homeroutes.home now instead of what it was before. And just to see that that works, we'll need to comment out those lines that are very broken. We restart our server and it started, so let's go have a look at it in the browser. And if we try to do that, it's actually going to fail miserably because of port undefined. If you caught that earlier, good for you. We need to give a default port if we didn't get one from our environment. So let's rerun, and now we see port 3000 in development mode, and now we can actually have a look at that in the browser. And here it is, it ran. We have a broken image because we haven't copied over the static assets yet. So let's go ahead and do that real quick with a simple make dir public, and then we'll grab anything that we had in there and put it in public. And this time it still didn't work because when we set up our static middleware, we have the wrong path. So this actually becomes another great opportunity to use our app path helper, because we just want this to be the public there. Make sure we have our correct number of parentheses. I don't think it is. No, need one more. And now when we come to the browser, there we go. We're sort of back to where we were before, but with a much more organized application in the process. So to get back to parity, we would just need to wire up those routes for these other paths here. But before we do that, I want to add one more helper into our config application. And that is a method called route, which is essentially just a shortcut for doing an app require for app routes. So rather than this big mess here, we can just get a route called home routes, and we restart our server, reload the page, and it works just fine. The reason for that is because it's just a lot less typing. With a snap of our magical fingers then, we do the exact same wiring up process for all the other routes. And we did change the names of these functions from how they were in episode 7 because all of the routes were crammed in one file. We needed a way to distinguish the create an adventure from the create anything else. So these are simplified as well. And we're just pulling in the route files that we looked at before, and we can restart our server, come back to the app, and then we can go to adventures, and we retain that bit about the username from before. That'll get fixed in future episodes, and we can have our adventures. We can even cheat, which is great, and we can have a look at the loot. And so there we have it, an app that's a lot better organized and ready for future development. A well-structured application is of course more than just route handlers. So we might also have in our app a commands folder for the command pattern if you like that. If you're into models, you can have app models. If you're into presenters, which are also nice, you can have presenters. To give you a sneak peek of next week, you can have views. We're finally going to get rid of these horrible strings in our handlers that we've had. And then of course in setting up those directories, we would also set up additional helpers off of our global app object to make requiring them in other files a lot easier. Now, if you like this app structure and want to play around with it some more and not have it be node slash, I did put up a blank version of it that pretty much just has like the config file in place. I'm sorry, not the config file, the application file in place that you can see here. It has a few other additions that we're going to be getting into more as we progress. And so that might be a useful resource for you. And I'll link to it in the show notes. We'll close off here with one more little neat trick discovered by someone at home in Texas. If you go into the node REPL with this configuration setup that we have, you can do something like this. And assuming that you had lots of other files like your models and your database access all set up and whatever, as you can see here, we have access to our whole app environment now inside of the node REPL. So one of the big gains from this structure is that we decoupled actually loading our application and everything about it from being connected to an HTTP server. When we get into testing in a few episodes, this is going to help us again because we'll be able to load our app environment in the context of our test suite rather than in the context of an HTTP server listening for requests. On that note, we sign off. Happy New Year, folks, and until next time, happy coding. If you've been watching the episodes and want to add any comments or questions about them, don't forget that each episode has a comments tab where you can say something. And also, the site has a feedback where you can find contact information. So if you think I'm talking too much, or maybe there are just some other topics that you want to see covered, let me know. Thanks for watching.